She heard it the way one hears a door close in a distant wing of the house. Not the words first, but the quality of the silence that preceded them. Venetia Stratton had been walking the upstairs corridor toward the morning room with the deed of separation folded inside her writing case, the leather worn soft at the corners from months of carrying it, of taking it out and reading the solicitor's careful hand and putting it back again. And she had stopped because the library door stood 6 inches open, and her husband's voice carried through the gap with the particular clarity that old houses grant to those who are not meant to hear. He was speaking to Lord Maitland. She knew this because Maitland had arrived after luncheon, and the two men had withdrawn to the library with a decanter of port. And she had thought nothing of it because Maitland's visits had become one of the few rhythms of the household that still functioned. A friend calling upon a friend, requiring nothing of her, expecting nothing. She had been grateful for it. She had been grateful in recent months for anything that did not require her to sit across from Emmerich at a table and pretend that the distance between them was merely the width of mahogany. Maitland said something she could not quite catch. A question, measured and careful, the way men spoke when they were circling something they were not certain they wished to raise. And then Emmerich's voice, low and unhesitating and stripped of every careful formality she had heard from him in the past 11 months. I would marry her again. Venetia's hand tightened on the writing case. The leather creaked beneath her fingers. There was a pause. Maitland's, she was certain, and then a sound that might have been a glass set down. Without alteration, Emmerich said, without amendment, if the whole business were put before me again tomorrow, the arrangement, the terms, the settlement, I would sign every document and stand at that altar and speak the words, and I would mean them more than I meant them the first time, which is saying rather a great deal, because I meant them then. She did not move. She stood in the corridor with the afternoon light falling across the turkey runner and the dust motes drifting in the pale gold shaft from the landing window, and she held the writing case containing the deed that Mr. Frith had drawn up with such meticulous attention, and she listened to her husband say the thing he had never once said to her. The marriage had not always been cold. That was the cruelty of it, not that there had been nothing, but that there had been something, and she had watched it drain away like water from a basin with a crack too fine to see. Emmerich had courted her in the spring of the previous year with a directness she had found startling and then, gradually, moving. He was not a man of speeches. He had called upon her father, Sir Anthony Lyle, and stated his intentions with the efficiency of a man placing an order. But there had been a quality beneath the efficiency, a steadiness in the way he looked at her across the drawing room at Lisle Park that made her believe he was not merely selecting a suitable wife from the available candidates. She had been 23, which was old enough to have stopped expecting a proposal from any quarter. She was the second daughter of a baronet of modest standing and moderate fortune, and her elder sister Philippa had married 2 years prior, a comfortable match with a clergyman in Hampshire, and her mother had begun looking at Venetia with a particular expression that meant she was calculating how long the household could sustain an unmarried daughter before something would have to be given up. Emmerich had not minded that she was plain-spoken. That had been the first remarkable thing. Most men who called upon Sir Anthony's daughters wanted ornamental conversation, light, deferring, suggestive of compliance without the inconvenience of actual opinion. Emmerich had listened when she spoke about the management of her father's tenants, about the drainage scheme she had proposed for the lower pastures, about the new schoolroom she had persuaded Sir Anthony to fund for the estate children. He had listened, and he had asked questions, and the questions had been intelligent. They married in September. The wedding had been small, held at the parish church in the village near Lisle Park, and she had worn a gown of pale silk with a spencer of cream wool, and he had stood at the altar in a dark blue tailcoat with his expression arranged into something that she later understood was not severity but concentration, the face of a man determined to remember every detail. The first months at Langford Park had been good, not passionate, not dramatic. Venetia had not expected drama and would not have known what to do with it, but good. The house was large and well run under Mrs. Vickery's management, and the estate was sound under Waring's stewardship, and Venetia had found her place in the domestic machinery with a competence that she believed Emmerich appreciated. They breakfasted together. They dined together. He told her, in his spare way, about his business in the House of Lords, about the drainage bill he supported, about the quarterly rents and the new roof for the East tenants' cottages. It was not warmth, precisely, but it was proximity. And proximity, she had believed, was the soil in which warmth eventually grew. She could not say when it began to change. That was the thing she had turned over and over during the long evenings when she sat in the morning room with her needlework and listened to the clock mark the minutes until she could decently retire. There had been no single moment, no argument, no betrayal, no door slammed or cruel word spoken. There had only been a gradual recession, like the tide pulling back from a shore so slowly that one did not notice the sand drying until it was too late to wade in again. He stopped coming to breakfast. Not suddenly. First it was one morning and 3, then 2. Then she found herself eating alone in the dining room with the footman standing against the wall and the eggs cooling on the sideboard. She told herself he was occupied. He had correspondence. He had business. He stopped telling her about the House of Lords. He stopped asking about the tenants. He stopped entering the morning room in the evenings. By January of their second year, they lived in the same house the way 2 guests might inhabit the same inn, courteously, efficiently, without any particular reason to seek each other out. She passed him in corridors. He inclined his head. She inclined hers. There was one evening, late February, the frost thick on the windows and the fire burning low in the morning room, when she had gathered her courage and gone to the library door. She had stood there with her hand raised to knock, and through the wood she had heard his pen scratching steadily across paper, and the sound had been so self-contained, so complete in its solitude, that her hand had fallen back to her side. She returned to the morning room and picked up her needlework and stared at the pattern until the stitches blurred. There was another morning when they passed on the landing and he paused, actually paused as though he intended to say something, and she had waited, and the pause had extended into something unbearable. And then he had said, "Good morning, Venetia," in precisely the tone he would have used with a dinner guest whose name he could not quite recall, and she had said, "Good morning," and they had continued in opposite directions, and that had been the morning she understood that the marriage was not merely cooling, but had, in some fundamental way, already gone cold. She had wept once, only once, in her dressing room, with the door locked and the curtains drawn, sitting on the floor with her back against the wardrobe, because she could not bring herself to weep in a chair like a civilized person when nothing about the situation felt civilized. It lasted perhaps 10 minutes. Then she washed her face, straightened her hair, and went downstairs to oversee the week's menus with Mrs. Vickery, and her voice did not waver, and the housekeeper looked at her with an expression that said she knew, and neither of them mentioned it. Mrs. Vickery noticed, because Mrs. Vickery noticed everything. The housekeeper had been at Langford Park for 19 years, and she had the quality of observation that comes from watching a household through 3 generations. She saw the temperature of a marriage the way a gardener reads soil. She said nothing to Venetia directly, because Mrs. Vickery understood boundaries, but Venetia caught her watching sometimes, and the expression on the housekeeper's face was not curiosity, but sorrow. The solicitor had been Venetia's decision, arrived at quietly, methodically, in the manner she approached everything. She had written to Mr. Frith in London, a solicitor recommended by Philippa's husband, who had handled a property matter for the Hampshire parish, and she had explained her circumstances in the plain language she preferred. The marriage was not violent. It was not scandalous. There was no mistress that she knew of, no public embarrassment. There was simply nothing. The Duke of Langford had married her, installed her in his house, and then proceeded to forget she was there. Mr. Frith had replied with professional delicacy. A formal deed of separation was entirely possible. It would require negotiation between the parties, terms of maintenance, arrangements for residence. It would not be pleasant, but it was a well-established legal instrument, and if the Duchess wished him to draw up a preliminary document for her review, he would do so with discretion. She had received the document in March. She had read it in her dressing room with the door locked and the candles burning low, and she had understood every clause, and she had felt nothing at all except a quiet, settling certainty that this was the correct course. One did not remain in a house where one was not wanted. One did not occupy a marriage that had ceased to function. One simply arranged things properly and withdrew. She had been carrying the document for 3 weeks when she heard him speak in the library. Now she stood in the corridor, and the words settled into her like stones dropping into still water, each one sending ripples outward through everything she had believed for the past 11 months. I would marry her again, without alteration, without amendment. The words of a man who was not performing for an audience, because he did not know he had one. Maitland spoke again, more clearly this time. Then why, in God's name, do you not tell her? The pause that followed was long enough that Venetia heard the fire crackle in the library grate. "Because she already knows," Emmerich said. "It was apparent from the beginning. I chose her. I married her. What further declaration does the matter require?" Maitland said something Venetia could not hear. It might have been a laugh, but it carried no mockery. "You're describing a contract," Maitland said, "not a marriage. They are the same thing. They are categorically not the same thing, and the fact that you believe they are explains rather a lot about the temperature of your household." There was another silence. Then Emmerich said very quietly, "She has not come to the library in 4 months. She does not sit with me after dinner. She has rearranged the household so that we occupy the same building without being in the same room. And you believe this is her preference? I believe she has made her position clear. Have you asked her?" The silence this time was the longest. Venetia stood absolutely still, the writing case pressed against her bodice, and waited. "No," Emmerich said. "I have not asked her." She heard the shift of a chair, the soft sound of Maitland rising. "Then you know precisely nothing about her position, Stratton. You have inferred it, which is an entirely different thing." Venetia turned from the door. She walked back down the corridor, her steps measured and even on the carpet, and she entered her dressing room, and she sat in the chair beside the window, and she placed the writing case on the table, and she sat there for a very long time. She thought about the letter she had written to Mr. Frith. She remembered the precise words. "I find myself in a marriage which, while not unhappy in any demonstrable way, has ceased to be a marriage in any meaningful one." She had been proud of that sentence when she wrote it. It was clear. It was accurate. It contained no self-pity and no accusation. It was the sentence of a woman who had assessed her circumstances rationally and concluded that the rational course was departure. She thought about the words she had just heard through the library door. "I would marry her again." She placed them beside Mr. Frith's careful sentence, and she examined them the way she would examine 2 columns of figures that should balance but did not, and she understood that one of them was wrong, and she was no longer certain it was Emmerich's. The light moved across the room. The shadows lengthened. Mrs. Vickery knocked once, softly, to ask if the Duchess would be dressing for dinner, and Venetia said yes, she would, and her voice was steady, and Mrs. Vickery paused at the threshold in the way that meant she had heard something in the steadiness itself, but she only nodded and withdrew. Venetia opened the writing case. She took out Mr. Frith's document, and she read it again. The clauses, the provisions, the language of dissolution. It was well drafted. The terms were fair. It represented exactly what she had asked for, a clean, quiet, dignified ending to a marriage that had already ended in every way that mattered, except it had not. She understood that now with a clarity that was almost physical, a shift in the chest like a key turning in a lock that had rusted shut. The marriage had not ended. It had simply never been spoken aloud. He had assumed she knew. She had assumed he did not care. They had built an entire architecture of silence on 2 assumptions that were both, it now appeared, wrong. She folded the document. She placed it back in the writing case. She did not destroy it. She was not that sort of woman, the sort who made grand gestures in the privacy of her own room. She simply put it away, and then she dressed for dinner in a gown of sage green muslin with a cream sash, and she went downstairs. They dined as they always dined, at opposite ends of the long table, the candlelight making pools on the polished wood, the footman moving along the walls. He spoke once to remark upon the lamb, and she replied that Mrs. Vickery had engaged a new cook's assistant who had trained in Brighton. He nodded. She nodded. The meal continued. She watched him across the length of the table, and she thought about what Maitland had said. You were describing a contract, not a marriage. And she understood with the particular clarity that comes from hearing one's own situation articulated by someone else, that Maitland was right, and that Emmerich genuinely did not see the distinction. He had chosen her. He had married her. In his understanding, the matter was settled, and everything that followed was simply the administration of a decision already made. That he had failed to administer even the most basic currency of a marriage, presence, attention, the daily act of making another person feel wanted, had not occurred to him as a failure. It had not occurred to him at all. She set down her fork. The footman stepped forward, assuming she had finished. She waved him back. She was not finished. She was, in fact, only beginning. But when they rose from the table, and he turned toward the library as he always did, she did not turn toward the morning room. "Emmerich." He stopped. He turned. The candlelight caught the line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders beneath the dark wool of his evening coat. He looked at her and she saw, for the first time in months, that he was actually looking, not glancing, not acknowledging, but looking at her with the full weight of his attention. "I should like to speak with you," she said. They went into the small sitting room, the one between the library and the morning room that neither of them used, which was precisely why she chose it, neutral ground. She sat in the chair nearest the fire. He remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back. "What should you like to discuss?" he asked, and his voice had the quality of a man bracing for something. "I heard you speaking to Lord Maitland this afternoon." The color did not drain from his face. It was subtler than that, a stillness that moved through him like a shadow crossing a wall, starting at the jaw and settling somewhere behind the eyes. "I was passing in the corridor," she continued. "The library door was open. I did not intend to listen, but I heard what you said, and I cannot pretend that I did not." He said nothing. "You told him you would marry me again?" "Yes." "Without alteration?" "Yes." She looked at him across the small sitting room, with its cold fireplace and its unused furniture, and its air of a room that existed between two lives that had failed to intersect, and she asked the question that she should have asked 11 months ago, or 6 months ago, or 3 weeks ago, when she had written to Mr. Frith and received his careful document and begun carrying it against her body like a wound. "Then why have you never said it to me?" He was quiet for a long time. The clock on the mantel ticked. Somewhere in the house a door closed softly. Mrs. Vickery making her evening rounds, checking the candles, the shutters, the small securities of a household that ran on routine. "Because I assumed it was evident," he said at last. "I chose you, Venetia. Among every woman I might have married, and there were candidates pressed upon me by my mother, by society, by the logic of rank and fortune. I chose you. I rode to your father's house. I asked for your hand. I married you. I brought you to Langford Park and gave you authority over my household and my estate. I did not know what further evidence was required." "Words," she said quietly. "The evidence required was words." He looked at her as though she had said something in a language he understood grammatically but could not parse for meaning. "You assumed I knew," she said. "I assumed you did not care. We have spent 11 months building a marriage on 2 wrong assumptions, and the result is that I have been carrying a deed of separation in my writing case for 3 weeks. The stillness that had been in his face moved to his hands. She watched his fingers tighten behind his back. "A deed of separation," he repeated, "drawn up by a solicitor in London. Mr. Frith, the terms are fair and the arrangement is entirely legal." She paused. "I have not filed it." "But you intended to." "I intended to do what appeared to be the only rational thing. You had ceased to speak to me. You had ceased to seek my company. You had arranged your life so that I occupied no part of it. What was I to conclude, Emmerich, except that you wished me gone?" He unclasped his hands. He moved to the chair opposite hers and he sat down, which was itself remarkable. Emmerich did not sit when he was uncomfortable. He stood, he paced, he positioned himself near windows. That he sat now, across from her, at her level, told her something she had not expected to learn tonight. "I wished nothing of the kind," he said. I have wished every day of the past 11 months that you would look at me the way you looked at me in your father's drawing room, when I told you about the drainage scheme and you told me I had miscalculated the gradient by a factor of 2. Despite everything, something moved at the corner of her mouth. You had. I know I had, and you corrected me without the slightest hesitation, and I thought, there, that is the woman I want in my house. Then why did you stop coming to breakfast?" He looked away. It was the first time he had broken her gaze since they sat down, and she understood that whatever he said next would be the thing he least wanted to say. "Because you stopped looking up when I entered the room." The words landed like a hand placed flat on a table. She stared at him. "I stopped looking up," she said slowly, "because you stopped acknowledging me when you sat down. I stopped acknowledging you because your expression had become courteous, formal, the expression you wore for callers. I believed I was intruding upon your morning. You were my husband, yes, and you looked at me as though I were the vicar, and so you withdrew, and so I withdrew, because I did not know, I have never known, how to ask for something I believed had already been refused. It is not a skill that was cultivated in me." She heard, beneath the words, the outline of something larger, the shape of a man who had been raised to consider decisiveness sufficient, to whom the act of choosing was the complete expression of feeling, and who had genuinely never learned that a choice, however sincere, must be spoken aloud and spoken repeatedly to remain real. He had not been cruel. He had been inarticulate, and his inarticulacy had nearly cost them everything. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, crammed with 11 months of mornings and evenings and corridors and inclined heads and closed doors, all of it built on the same catastrophic architecture. Two people who had each interpreted the other's withdrawal as instruction and responded with withdrawal of their own, until the space between them was so wide that neither could see across it. "We are both," Venetia said carefully, "rather spectacular idiots." He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, not yet, but the ghost of what a smile would look like if it were allowed to arrive. "I would not have used that precise language." "No, you would have used no language at all, which is the entirety of the problem." He leaned forward, his elbows rested on his knees. She had never seen him sit like this. It was not the posture of a duke, it was the posture of a man. "What shall we do?" he asked. "We shall begin again. Not from the beginning. We are past that. And I do not wish to pretend the past year did not happen. But from here, from this room. You will tell me things. Not about the drainage bill, not about the quarterly rents, though I want to hear those too, but about what you think, what you feel, what you want from this marriage." "I want you in it," he said immediately. "That is the whole of what I want." "Then you must say so, not once, repeatedly. Because I am not, as it turns out, capable of inferring affection from silence, however clear you believe the silence to be." He reached across the space between the chairs and he took her hand. His fingers were warm and slightly unsteady, and she felt the contact move through her like the first warmth of a fire lit in a room that has been cold for too long. "I would marry you again," he said. "I am telling you now since I failed to tell you before. I would marry you again tomorrow. I would marry you again every day for the rest of my life, if the law permitted it. It does not. Then once will have to suffice, but I will say it as often as you require." She looked down at their joined hands. His thumb moved across her knuckles, tentative, exploratory, as though he were learning the geography of something he had assumed he already knew. "The deed of separation," he said quietly. "I will write to Mr. Frith tomorrow. He will be relieved. I believe he found the entire business rather melancholy." "Venetia." "Yes." "Thank you for not filing it." She tightened her fingers around his. "Thank you for saying something worth overhearing." The restoration was not instant. Venetia had not expected it to be, and she would have distrusted it if it were. What happened instead was slower, more deliberate, and therefore more real. He came to breakfast the following morning. She looked up when he entered. He sat in his chair and he told her about a letter he had received from a fellow peer regarding the proposed corn levy, and she told him his position was sound, but his reasoning in the third paragraph was muddled, and something in his expression loosened, not a smile, but the absence of the careful blankness that had been there for nearly a year. She resumed her evenings in the library. Not every evening. Some nights she wanted the morning room and her needlework and the particular quality of solitude that was chosen rather than imposed. But 3 nights in 4, she sat in the chair by the south window and read while he worked at his desk, and the silence between them was no longer empty but occupied, filled with the particular warmth of two people who have decided to remain. Mrs. Vickery observed the shift with the discretion of a woman who had spent nearly 2 decades managing a great house. She said nothing. She adjusted. The breakfast service was laid for 2 again, without instruction. Fresh candles appeared in the library's south sconces. A second teacup materialized on the evening tray. Waring, who had served as steward long enough to understand that the health of an estate was inseparable from the health of the marriage that governed it, noted that the Duchess had resumed her inquiries about the tenants' cottages and the kitchen garden expansion, and he made his reports accordingly, to both of them now, in the study after breakfast, as he had in the first months of the marriage. Lord Maitland called again in April. He took one look at the drawing-room, Venetia pouring tea, Emmerich standing at the window with his hand resting on the back of her chair, and said nothing about it, because Maitland was the sort of friend who understood that the best response to good news was to behave as though it were not remarkable. There was an evening, not long after Maitland's visit, when Emmerich entered the library and found Venetia already seated in the south window chair with a volume of Cowper open in her lap. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up, and the look she gave him was not the look of a caller or a dinner guest or a woman performing courtesy. It was the look she had given him in her father's drawing room, direct and assessing and slightly impatient, as though she expected him to say something worth hearing and was prepared to wait, but not indefinitely. He crossed the room and sat in his chair, and he opened his correspondence, and after a moment he said, without looking up, "The corn levy has been defeated in committee, and Lord Harborough is blaming me personally." "Is he correct too?" "Entirely." "Good." Lord Harborough's position on the levy was mathematically illiterate. He looked at her then, and the expression on his face was not the ghost of a smile, but the thing itself, small, startled, and entirely genuine. She returned her attention to Cowper. The fire crackled. The candles burned steadily in their sconces. The library, which had been his room alone for nearly a year, became theirs again. The letter to Mr. Frith was sent. The deed of separation was returned to the solicitor's office, where it was filed with a note in Frith's tidy hand. Matter resolved, no further action required. Venetia kept the writing case. She used it for correspondence. Spring came to Langford Park, with the slow extravagance of an English countryside remembering itself. The chestnuts leafed along the drive. The lower pastures flooded and drained as they always did. The tenants' children appeared in the lane on their way to the schoolroom. And Venetia, who had established the schoolroom as one of her first acts as Duchess, walked down on Tuesday mornings to read to them, and Emmerich, who had never accompanied her before, began walking with her. And the children stared because they had never seen the Duke at close range, and he was taller than they had imagined. The first time he said it to her unprompted, not in response to a question, not in the echo of their conversation in the sitting room, but simply because it occurred to him, and he chose to speak it. They were in the garden. She was examining the rosebed that the gardener had pruned badly, and Emmerich was standing beside her with his hands clasped behind his back in the posture she had once read as indifference and now understood as attention. "I would choose you again," he said. She did not look up from the roses, but she reached out and took his hand, and the garden held the two of them in the late afternoon light, and neither of them moved for a long time. Their son was born the following winter, a boy with his father's dark eyes and his mother's direct manner of looking at the world as though she expected it to explain itself. They named him Anthony, after Venetia's father, and the christening was held at the parish church with Maitland standing as godfather and Mrs. Vickery weeping in the second pew in a manner she would later deny absolutely. Emmerich held his son in the library that evening and told him, in the grave and formal tone he used for matters of genuine importance, that he had married the most remarkable woman in England, and that Anthony should endeavor to remember this when he was old enough to understand what it meant. Venetia, passing the library door, heard every word. She did not go in. She stood in the corridor, the same 6 inches of open door, the same quality of light. And she listened to her husband telling their son the truth about their marriage, and she understood that some words are meant to be overheard, that the private voice, the unguarded voice, the voice that speaks when it believes it is alone, is sometimes the most honest thing a person has to offer, and that the courage is not in saying it publicly, but in meaning it when no one is watching. Years later, Anthony was 5, and his sister Cecily was 3, and the household had expanded into the particular cheerful chaos that small children impose upon even the most orderly of estates. Venetia passed that corridor again. The library door was open. Emmerich was sitting in his chair with Anthony on one knee and Cecily wedged firmly against his other side, and he was explaining, in the patient and slightly bewildered tone of a man who has discovered that small children ask questions for which no education prepares one, how marriage worked. "You find the person," he said, "who makes you think more clearly, and who tells you when your reasoning is muddled, and who looks at you as though you are not merely the Duke of Langford but a person worth knowing. And then you marry that person. And then, this is the important part, and I want you both to remember it, you tell them. You do not assume they know. You tell them." Cecily asked if she could have a biscuit. Anthony asked if Mama knew. "Your mother," Emmerich said, "knows everything. She's considerably more intelligent than I am. This is another thing you should remember." Venetia closed the door quietly. She walked down the corridor toward the morning room, where the tea tray was waiting and the fire was lit, and Mrs. Vickery had placed fresh candles in the sconces. and she sat in her chair by the window, and she smiled, and the smile was not for anyone but herself, and it was enough. They arrive here, like a letter that was always written and finally read aloud whenever they are ready.